My name is Neil Haney, one of the docents at the Baltimore Museum of Industry. We're standing at the old entrance to what used to be Mr. Platt's warehouse and offices. It was built in approximately 1864 during the Civil War. He came here from New England, where he began his business in about 1849, going to Chicago and then to the Eastern Shore and finally settling in Baltimore. This building was one of many on the property, and it was used for warehousing and the offices. The archway that you pass through into this building is one of two that contains one of the original sliding doors into the warehouse. And if you look carefully at the front of it, you will see that it has been covered in pieces of tin, which we suspect is pieces of old cans, which have been nailed up there for insulation. As you pass into this building, you will notice the wide planked wooden floors, which disguise a full basement below. Above you will be the trusses for the roof, and especially interesting, behind the museum walls, you will see the original brick walls, which have large windows which have been whited out. In the early days, lighting was done mostly by sunshine into these old buildings. The first alcove that you see has a large portrait of Sandy Beach Platt, who was the owner. Adjacent to his portrait is a very small photograph of the Platt Company some years later. And if you look very closely, you will see railroad tracks coming from the street and turning into that little tunnel. The railroad would have left a freight car here for perhaps a few days until it was loaded, and then come back and hitched it up again and taken it out across the country where the oysters were distributed. The next alcove represents a shucking shed. At one point, there were about 100 canneries in Baltimore. If it was an oyster cannery, there was always a shucking shed to go with it. The picture of this shucking shed indicates a very updated style, because most shucking sheds were open to the air. It was simply a roof, and it was very cold, and it was a nasty job. The shuckers were generally segregated. They were either all women, all men. Most of the time they were all black, because this was a very low-wage job. These particular shuckers, although they were not from the Platt Company, worked in some comfort. You notice that they throw the shucked shells onto the floor, and at the end of the day, these shells are simply swept out and disposed of. Directly behind this building, there was a kiln, and in this kiln, many of these shells were burned and ground up. The railroad tracks that came into that tunnel that we spoke about earlier were simply buried under layers of shells over the years. There's a shucking stall on either side here to indicate how the workers were able to keep their feet dry. And for every pail that a shucker filled, he would be paid a certain wage, which would be a token which he would be able to take to the company store and to spend. On one of the side walls, you will notice a photograph of laborers. This particular photograph is of children, because the child labor laws were not passed until about 1908 and 1914. Children were very common workers in these industries. There's even a small babe in arms here. Every cannery produced its own tokens and had their own name on it. And these tokens were the wages for the workers, and they could only be spent at the particular company store where the worker worked. It is said that a lot of the workers inadvertently dropped their tokens, and they fell down between the wide cracks that you're standing on into the basement, and that's where we actually found some of the tokens that are on exhibit. You may ask why these canneries do not exist today in such numbers. And of course, the answer is the supply of oysters has drastically reduced over the years for a number of things. One, diseases that are in the bay, and number two, the greed of man for overharvesting. And one of the culprits for overharvesting, hanging from the ceiling, if you'll look behind you, is a dredge, which was pulled behind skipjacks that would pull up hundreds of oysters at a time instead of just a few at a time with the old-fashioned rake. And so this was the device that led to the demise of the oyster in the Chesapeake Bay. As we move along, we come into the processing area, the centerpiece of which is a pressure retort, which, if you look carefully, goes much deeper than it appears, goes down towards the basement. This is one of several that were housed at the Platt Company, and it is a sophisticated version of earlier steamers that were used to steam only a few cans at a time. By steaming 500 cans at a time, the owner was assured of making himself a much larger profit. The steamer was invented by Mr. Shriver, an earlier member of the family of Pam Shriver, the tennis star whom you may recognize. Why steaming? The process of steaming the cans of oysters is an attempt to get rid of the bacteria in the raw oysters. When Platt started his canning business up in New York, he actually shipped his canned oysters off to California for the 49ers who were out there digging for gold. Opposite the steamer is a track running along the side of the wall, and you'll see a little fellow standing in front of it who was obviously working before the child labor laws were passed. And he is a can mover. He simply moves cans from one area of the building to another during the processing. When electricity came into use, then we were able to bring in not only electric light, but electric machines such as this one. So the cans could be moved from one area to another. On the far wall is another large photograph by Lewis Hine. And if you will look at it carefully, you may notice something that looks a little fishy. Look at the small boy who has something on his lap, and you will certainly recognize it not as oysters, but as green beans. So this photograph, for a number of reasons, was taken in the summertime. And you might wonder why are string beans being done in an oyster cannery. Typically, oysters are harvested only during the months of the year that have the letter R. So May, June, July, and August are not oyster months. This is the time of the year when we leave the oysters alone so that they can breed and develop. During the summer months, these canneries converted from oyster packing to fruit and vegetable packing. Some of the workers were sent down to Anne Arundel County where they did the harvesting. Others stayed here where they did the shelling, the picking, whatever was necessary, and then the canning process continued. You notice the rather ethnic look in some of these people. It is very possible many of these people could not even speak English because this was a period of high immigration into the United States, particularly in this area of Locust Point. So many of these people were first generation. They could be taught these kinds of skills very easily. They did not even have to speak English to do their jobs.